All right. How's everybody doing? Welcome to VMware Escapology. I'm Josh Smith. This is Jazel Spellman. First off, I'd like to just mention that AbdulAziz Hariri was supposed to be the other speaker until Jazel barged his way in. I'm kidding. Abdul had a home emergency and couldn't make it. So Jazel thankfully filled in, otherwise you'd be listening to me babble and it would be horrific. So as a consequence, however, there were, it did kind of cause us some complications. So you'll see in a minute or in a little while, realistically. Apologies. It's the way it goes. All right. So what you're looking at here is just a video from Pondone 2017, where it's not horribly exciting, but there's a full VMware escape, and it's not horribly clear exactly what's going on until you realize that notepad is running in the host and not the guest. So it's going to loop if you didn't quite catch it the first time. I feel very pinned to this microphone. So local exploit looks like it's in the guest, but in reality, it's in the host. So there was also another one that was fully came in from Internet Explorer. Edge, sorry, thank you. Exploited Edge, escaped the sandbox, and then escaped out into the host that was hosting that VM. So, it's serious escapology going on here.
And the reason for not showing that video is there's also a kernel exploit, because it has to do it from ring 0 within the guest. And all in all, it takes like 2 minutes, and that's just a long video for waiting and twiddling thumbs.
So over the past year or so, VMware escapes and VMware attacks and virtualization attacks in general have been on the rise. So one thing that we feel like, even in our own jobs, we get this false sense of security that VMs are a level of isolation, which they just aren't. One thing we wanted to bring to this audience was some knowledge and some capability in order to be able to demonstrate some of these things. I haven't done pen testing in quite a few years now, but there's always a tendency it's hard to convey risk, a certain amount of risk, especially when the CIO or somebody else is, this is not a problem, right? It can be very hard to change their minds. So that's one of the things we kind of want to try to bring, some capability for the pen testing community that they can, make that message clear. Also, I would imagine anyway, that sometimes you hit a VM and it's kind of a dead end for you. And so we'd like to sort of, release that, so make it no longer a dead end for you. So this is the high level we're going to talk about. We're obviously going to do some introductions, the usual junk. We're going to do a really simplified version of like one slide of the general VMware architecture. We're going to talk about host to guest communication, guest to host. We'll be talking about something called the backdoor interface. Yes, that's the name of the interface. We're not making that up. We'll talk about exploiting some of the capabilities that are in the backdoor. We're going to talk about some ways to escape the VMs, which obviously is kind of the gist of this talk. So this is Abdul. Abdul can't be here. He's an amazing reverse engineer. He's actually had an article written about him as making a living as a bug hunter. He's been with us exactly the same amount of time I have, so about 4 years. I should have also mentioned that he's the case lead, so he's like, if you've ever submitted to ZDI or had any interactions with him, he's probably touched it, at least in the most recent, couple of months. This is me. Real exciting. The biggest thing probably to take away is that I used to be a Metasploit dev, so at least that helps with obviously bringing this kind of a presentation forward, although I'm definitely losing my touch. I used to be a pen tester for the Air Force, but that was quite a while ago. And then
All right, I'm Jazel Spellman, but usually go by Wandering Glitch. I am the research lead on the Zero Day Initiative team, and for those who don't know, we're one of the bug brokers. We buy vulnerabilities. I guess the world's largest vendor-agnostic bug bounty. We also run Pwn2Own, and that's how we have a couple of these exploits, the one we just demonstrated, but then we just buy bugs.
You should ask. Does everybody know what ZDI is?
At this point, yeah.
We buy bugs from external researchers.
And then submit them straight to vendor, all to try and make things harder to exploit for the malicious people. However, we have a large corpus of bugs, and sometimes there are ways of making it better for like pen testers so that everyone ends up safer. On the team, I primarily do, and almost exclusively do, static analysis of binaries. That's really what I want to do. Security is kind of a accident for me. I really just want to mess with assembly. And I have also been working with VMware a lot with Abdul, which is why when he had his emergency, I was able to just come in. So, general architecture of VMware. A very, very massively overly simplified way of looking at it is that you have virtual CPUs, a guest, and then you have a hypervisor. And that hypervisor, because we're talking about VMware, is going to be Fusion, Workstation, or ESXi. And there's some sort of magic that happens between the hypervisor and the guest. And, oh, right. So yeah, what's going on in the middle? And what was I going with that? Right. The way it works is all black magic. There's some reversing that was done about 7-8 years ago, and then not a lot. And then this year, and really last year, as part of Pwn2Own, we started saying, hey, we will buy Pwn2Own, or we'll buy VMware privilege escalations. And all of a sudden, people started doing a little bit more research. We kind of pushed some people, and we were able to get more and more bugs submitted to our program and used inside Pwn2Own. And the key thing to take away with the VMware communication is that it occurs regardless of, or it's available to you regardless as to whether or not VMware tools is actually installed in the guest. And so like one thing that a lot of malware sandboxes do is you just don't install the VM tools, whether it's VirtualBox or Hyper-V or VMware or whatever, and they kind of assume that malware can't detect it. That is completely false. It is very detectable, and there are ways around that. So as far as how that works, there is the notion of something called the backdoor, and as Josh was saying, that is legitimately what VMware decided to name it. If you look at vmtools.dll, there are functions that are called backdoor, backdoor in out, backdoor in. If you look at Open VM Tools, where a lot of this is publicly documented and maintained by VMware for tools in, say, Linux, you can see the source code and the functions are named backdoor. Why they did this is questionable, but whatever. It's all done by using special I/O ports. And what I mean by that is there's an assembly instruction called in and another called out. And what they do is in the hypervisor, they hijack those instructions such that you can call them with certain magic values and certain registers and use that to communicate in and out with the hypervisor. Reasons you may want to do this are as simple as, hey, I'm running VMware tools X. Is that the latest? Should I upgrade? And it can respond yes or no. Or, hey, let's do guest time synchronization or drag and drop or copy and paste or shared file systems. There's a whole bunch of stuff that happens through these channels. And so it is very important. Main thing to keep in mind is that there's two main protocols within the backdoor channel. There are two other channels, but effectively we'll only talk about the backdoor channel. There's RPCI, and that is bidirectional, which is where we're paying attention because that means we can talk from the guest to the hypervisor. And then there's TCLO, which we're largely completely ignoring because that is used by the hypervisor to talk direct, or basically send commands to the guest. And then, as we're saying, the backdoor interface cannot be disabled. And what I mean by that is you can't disable access to the backdoor interface altogether. What you can do is disable certain portions. So if you have your VM, you can configure it to not allow drag and drop or not allow shared folders or not allow copy and paste, things like that. But you can still access the backdoor interface as a whole and still mess with all the other options. So, as we're saying, there are a lot of commands and functions that you can invoke using the backdoor interface, and I apologize that that's probably very hard to read. Most of these commands, or a good chunk of them, can be found in OpenVM tools on GitHub, and specifically in backdoor_def.h, where you can just see a bunch of pound defines describing loosely what the commands are. And the guest can't invoke all of these. Some of these are specifically for the host to send to the guest, and the guest can deal with them. And then some of them are disabled by default. If you can read the second to last one's backdoor command monitor control is disabled by default. But as the guest, you can invoke a lot more of these than you might think. And here's just kind of a high-level diagram of what the backdoor channel looks like. You have TCLO, which goes straight from the hypervisor to the guest. And then you have RPCI, which has two different modes of function. There's low bandwidth, and low bandwidth happens by, you can send 24 bytes to the hypervisor, and it can have a reply of 16 bytes. And then high bandwidth is anything greater than that. Sorry. And that's basically it. And as we were saying, there are a couple of things that build on top of this, but we'll get into that later. As far as actually doing this, in assembly, it's very, very straightforward. There's 5 lines, more if you want to read it back. But basically, set magic value, VMXH, in EAX. Set your command number, so whatever backdoor command you want to run in ECX. EBX is an optional parameter, like if you're just going to read a value back, completely ignore it. If you're going to set something, then that's where that value goes. And then you set the VMware I/O port in DX to either VX or VY, depending on if you're doing low bandwidth or high bandwidth. Yes. VMware does offer some tools to make kind of poking and messing with the hypervisor a little bit easier. And one of the things it releases specifically in the VMware tools for Windows is RPC tool. They provide the source in OpenVM tools, and what this can do is send arbitrary RPCI commands. An RPCI command solely consists of a string, and if you're going to send an argument to it, that it's basically command and then space string, or space argument, space second argument, so on and so forth. You have no notion as to what the commands that you can send are. Like in this example, we're calling vmx.capability.tools is upgradable, and it's just returning 1. But you can find what those commands are either by looking through OpenVM tools, or even better for a superset to see everything. You can do a strength search in VMware VMX itself and grab everything. And using that, you can actually see what is actually going to be enabled in the binary you're looking at. Because what's enabled in VMware Workstation is going to be different from what's enabled in VMware Fusion versus ESXi, and just because of the hardware differences and platform differences. So in summary, we have this backdoor channel. It's used for guest to host communication. It hijacks the in and out instruction. RPCI is used primarily for guest to host, but it is bidirectional. TCLO is only used for host to guest, and so we completely ignore it. And the RPCI commands can be found in VMware VMX, but also in OpenVM tools. And OpenVM tools is just a goldmine of information, because you have all sorts of bit shifts and ORing and ANDing of all sorts of values, and there's really no good way of finding out what those are without OpenVM tools. It makes things so much easier. So, okay, we have a bunch of rather useless background info. What can we actually do with it? Let's look at, wrong way. Lot we can do with RPCI, and let's see what we can do with some of the backdoor commands that we were previously talking about. So we have these two, backdoor command get cell length and backdoor command get next piece. Based on the names, I would have no clue what they mean. They actually mean let's grab the length of whatever's currently on the clipboard in the host, and then get next piece will get 1 byte, or 1 word at a time from whatever's on the clipboard. And so you can call get cell length, find out what the length is, and then whatever value gets, iterate that number of times and call get next piece to retrieve clipboard data. And you can do this by just running the assembly I was showing in a second ago. And yes, you can just disable copy and paste and drag and drop, but as I was saying, a lot of malware sandboxes don't actually disable those. They just sort of never install the tools. And all of that functionality is only provided to the users provided by the VM by using the guest, by using the VMware tools. And if you're just depending on the tool's presence to determine whether or not you can access everything, you're kind of You're failing. And where we're going, we don't need libs.
Also, let's face it, if you disable copy, paste, and drag and drop, if you've ever been in a situation where you don't have those things enabled, it's kind of horrific using that VM. Right. So the likelihood of people disabling it and still using it for something horribly useful is a little low.
So looking at that assembly snippet from earlier and just modifying it for getting just the length of the value of the data on the clipboard, all we do is we no longer set anything in EBX, and now we set ECX to backdoor command get cell length, and very, very straightforward. However, as you can imagine, having various assembly for every single backdoor command would be a nightmare. What they do in OpenVMTools and in vmtools.dll is they have this backdoor function that just takes a struct and they use it as an in-out struct. So on the way in, it has registers that it then sends and sets to EAX, ECX, EBX, EDX, so on and so forth. And on the way out, it just reads back the relevant registers. And that's kind of what Josh was starting to mirror, but he'll go into why there's some complications with that in the Metasploit code. And yeah.
So you're going to see this little scorecard. I know Dustin wants me to say scorecard. So this is our comms guy. For each of the pieces of code, basically, that we're talking about, or Metasploit stuff. So we call this VMware Copy Pirate. Seemed good at the time. It's basically, so it's a post-gathering module. I assume most people are quite familiar with Metasploit. If I'm wrong, let me know. Also, I failed to mention before, if you have questions, pipe up. If you wait until the end, who knows if we'll be conscious enough to answer them properly. So the cause of this particular, I guess, issue is basically logic and, of course, the configuration, right? Well, what's the directionally, it can be guest to guest or guest to host. I probably shouldn't move too far away from the mic. I naturally want to wander, sorry. Yeah, who knows, I'll drop it. So you can imagine you can steal a copy buffer from another VM running on the same setup, or the host itself, which people are using password managers and all kinds of stuff. As it turns out, you can also write to the copy buffer. We haven't played with that yet, but you can imagine you can pull pretty fast. Someone copies something and then you just alter it and they paste it in. I think there's all kinds of fun that can be had there, but the impact is obviously kind of information leak. The hypervisor has affected our Fusion and Workstation, and as far as the guest and the host OS, it can be anything that those hypervisors support, and this basically works as designed. There's no particular anything to talk about it. When it comes to the framework side of implementing this, there's kind of two ways to go about it. One is the struct approach that Jazel mentioned, and then there's kind of reading from the I/O CPU thing, CPU I/O port at 16 bytes at a time. And effectively, I went down both paths in the end. And if you go down the struct side with having this object, you can use the bin data gem, which I don't know if I saw Spencer or Zero Steiner around, kind of turned me on to, which is a great way to just, is he there?
He's there. They're pointing at him.
This is like a giant light right there, so. But it's a great way to be able to really easily define something and then just pull the fields out and write to them as well. Ultimately, what this module needs is, of course, the ability to send backdoor commands. So we need some sort of Metasploit interface for it, right? So welcome the VMware lib, basically. It's currently an MSF post VMware, but like I said, or like I wrote up there, it may change. There were some challenges in making the library. It has to, at least with the current implementation, it needs to execute dynamically generated assembly at will, which kind of doesn't sound that hard, maybe, if you've played with the code base, and then after a while you start to realize it can be kind of hard, and there's two basic ways of doing it. We'll talk about that in a second. And of course, you have to allocate like buffers in order to be able to, read from, point to things. And keep in mind, you're doing all this stuff from the remote end, right? You're doing this on the framework side, and you've got this guest that you're trying to write memory into the memory on the guest. You're trying to do all sorts of things with it, right? You also would like to be able to read back from that I/O port. So you could write your own DLL, or lib, I should say, really. You would have to write different libs for each platform, and of course that's not exactly portable, but it is very doable. But more portable approaches, which I basically explored both because I wasn't sure which one was going to be, first of all, doable, and second, what's actually the best way to do it. And basically, right now it's post API, and I think at least as far as what Spencer and I have talked about, and other folks, Railgun would be ultimately the best and most portable way. The main thing is if you stick to the post API, you're calling stuff like process.memory.allocate, and only the Windows interpreter supports that, as far as I know. Anyway, correct me. I know there's a ton of Metasploit devs in here, so if I speak out of line, just shout. You're not going to hurt my feelings, especially at this point. Some of the other sort of complications are when you're executing this code in the post API, you're running in a thread. So I realize not everyone's not binary people, but it's different than running on a function. And in Railgun, it would be a nice simple sort of function, or at least simplistic, compared to the other approach. In both cases, if you have to assemble assembly, you're just going to assemble it using, well, at least I am using the Metasm gem. When you do the post API side, you kind of got to allocate, and you get an immediate pointer. Just push that in somewhere. You have to kind of manage that yourself. On the Railgun side, it could just say, put it on the stack, ESB plus 24 is my thing. I don't have to keep track of all these values. But and then, like I said, all the memory accessing, writing, protecting, marking as read-write, all that is done through the post API, which means it's limited to the post API. And the post API for this type of functionality is limited to the Windows interpreter, which is, for me anyway, not ideal. However, easier. Ideally, on the Railgun side, we could be platform. All these things are handled basically by Railgun, so you just kind of pawn it off, right? And Railgun, if you have a Railgun implementation, then any payload that supports Railgun, you now gain with this library. So, you could be attacking, well, anything that Railgun, any payload that Railgun supports. So, on Python, OS X, Linux, Unix, quite a bit of payload there. One of the other kind of tricky parts is how do you read the stuff back, right? So, and the post API side, you kind of got to read that whole 16-bit word at a time. Railgun side, I could just return a pointer and read the object. It would be way faster and easier. So, showing this is kind of, it doesn't look nice. So the way, with like 3 different VMs. So we stuck with 2, and we're using a binary implementation of it instead, so I don't have to have the 3 different VMs running.
Click real quick.
Did I not click on them?
No, I paused it.
Okay.
Just want to point out, which is incredibly hard to see, apologies for that when right-clicking into Notepad, there's nothing there's no paste. You'll have to take my word for it. It's just not bold. But the idea here is that VM on the right does not have VMware tools installed, and it's not an option to paste or see what's in the copy buffer.
Yeah, just sorting out, I think we're tricking you. There's nothing in the paste buffer currently.
Yeah.
Which is what that's trying basically to show. So I'm not a dolphin or whatever it says over there. And you can see that on the guest on the right. So the host is on the left and the guest is on the right. You can see that you're able to steal the copy buffer. So the meatier part, probably the sexier part that you might be more interested in, actually escaping VMs. So for the first one, we need to talk a little bit about HDFS, the host guest file system, and VMware host open.exe. So I think you're all, I assume almost everybody's in here has used a VM and they're at least somewhat familiar with HDFS. So basically it allows sharing, right? It's the host guest file system. It's supported in Fusion Workstation and ESXi, although in ESXi, of course, you can't like share directly from the hypervisor host to the VMs. but the functionality is still there and is still used for other things. Don't want to bore you too much with like the implementation of that whole thing, so we're just giving you a little one-slider here. We often speak at reverse engineering type conferences, so we're trying not to bore people to death with some reverse engineering stuff. So the HDFS request can be performed through the guest RPC requests, and that runs over. It can actually the mic. Sorry. Those can run over the backdoor we've already talked about. vSockets or TCP/IP. We're not looking at any of that because we want to stick to the core basic implementation that we are already working with. And you can see that the protocol itself is not exactly complicated. But the host guest file system in action, we can sniff HDFS commands in order to try to figure out what they are by hooking the function that parses RPC requests. We can also use the VMware HDFS client to actually just ask for like shares. I don't know. These are like random tools that are in VM tools you may or may not have messed with, but you can use them to just straight up enumerate any shares on a host, on a guest. I shouldn't say host. So what's VMware host open? Why are we talking about that? Well, it's shipped with VMware tools on Windows. The functionality still exists, best to our knowledge, on Linux using Workstation and that kind of thing, but the binary itself is not shipped. All it does is opens a file in the default application on the host machine, which already kind of sounds sketchy. But if you think of it, this is a Fusion-only thing, at least this current implementation. So actually, I think the whole thing, on the server side, I'm not entirely sure if it actually exists on Workstation. It does. Disregard.
It doesn't. Yeah.
Okay. And that picture there is just a picture of you popping basically help. And all it says is, I need a URL or I need a file. End of story. But what's important to remember here is it's the default application. You can't control any of that. It's on the host machine, and it goes over the back door. How does it work? If you want to see a ton of IDA, we could show you a lot more, but it's
Boring.
Brutal. This is the ghost in the shell action, as we like to say, but it's the function is this GHI host shell action, right? It's implemented in VMware VMX.exe, which is basically where all of this stuff on the server side, or on the hypervisor side, is going to be involved. It takes two arguments, basically an action URI and a target URI, which is kind of like file : / whatever, file, or a URL. So that obviously seems kind of interesting. So I wrote a module for that. Well, first to try to see if I could actually get Metasploit to create something that I can get the host to open with the default application that would actually give me code execution. Yeah, I can shove the default browser to any URL I want. But unless I have an exploit for whatever browsers I might be expecting to happen there, which obviously Safari by default, but most people will install Chrome or Firefox, and I'm not saying people don't have bugs for all three, but that is definitely a vector, but it requires another bug. It's a local exploit, VMware host open, is the name real original. The cause is also logic and configuration. I'm going to knock the podium over here in a second. The direction is guest to host. The impact, as you can see, is an escape. But it does have a lot of prereqs. I'm not trying to sugarcoat the fact that there aren't a bunch. Although a lot of them are bypassable, and we're basically investigating how many of those can we bypass. Can we bypass them all? Can we not have the binary at all? Obviously, it affects Fusion only, that we know of, and therefore Mac. The guest OS Windows, if you're using the binary. And we reported this to the vendor actually kind of a couple years ago, and I wrote the module, like a basic version of the module, and they said, yeah, sure. So that's up to the user, whether or not they want to allow this kind of thing. And I'll show you in a second where that setting is, which I didn't personally care for, but it was kind of determined that it's not an O day, if you will. Whereas generally if a vendor declines something, declines to fix it, and we think it's a valid, straight up O day, it's going to hurt people, we will, we did it to Foxit very recently. There was kind of a miscommunication, and they didn't patch, and then they patched, let's just say. In this case, not the case. VMware, no. The challenges in writing this Metasploit module. So it's a local exploit, but actually, like all of these local, like the VM escapes, I'm using the local exploit type, if you will, module type. But it's a little bit weird because it's not your average local. Locals are normally result in an escalated session, typically. And that's true-ish. In this case, though, we're resulting in a session that's not the same platform. And so, Metasploit wasn't expecting that, obviously, when locals were written. So we may need a new type, or maybe need to modify local so that it can support kind of what's the architecture that we're going to attack, like Windows, and what's the architecture we expect the session to come back on, which would obviously be totally different. Another kind of odd difficulty was getting the command exec portion of the post API to successfully call the host open binary with the UNC path. That was kind of a nightmare, quite honestly. I mean, it doesn't have to be a UNC path. A lot of people will mount their shares, but if they don't, and how can we get this payload to actually run? Like I said, it's like default application. Matter of fact, when I first wrote this, I had to basically output a shell script, and then it would run. Because if you just kind of say open shell script, it goes, well, this should run in the terminal. It's a default application, and it would run. And then I don't know at what point that stopped working, but it did. So now I just write a Mach-O, and it still runs. A binary format for OS X. We're trying not to rely on VMware tools, but this module definitely is reliant currently on VMware tools. Oops, I went too far. Like I said, it definitely requires VMware tools. But if you're keeping that dependency, because you can't get rid of the binary, let's say, then you can just use all the other parts of the VMware tools and make your life a lot easier. So this is basically an entirely logic-oriented module. It does require a writable VM share if you want to have arbitrary code execution, because you need to be able to write your arbitrary code somewhere. You can call binaries that are on the share but you gotta know what they do, obviously, and have something that's beneficial to you. How do you keep this not being available? That was a really roundabout way of saying that, but in settings, if you're running Fusion, settings, default apps, and there's literally a checkbox that says open your Windows files and web links using Mac applications. That used to, when you created a new VM, Windows VM in Mac and Fusion, that used to default to on. After about the same time we reported it, their answer was, well, the user has to choose now. So basically, you have to choose more isolated or less isolated. If you choose more isolated, you're in trouble. If you choose less isolated, you're fine. That's what it looks like. Open your Windows files and web links. It's a matter of fact, if you don't know that's on, there are times where it'll run automatically. It's frightening as all get out when you try to open a URL and it opens in your host, and you're like, what just happened? And shut it down. That's how I found out. That's how I first found out about it anyway. I was like, what is causing this? Play. So we got our workstation host VM, flying around. You can see that share is empty. That's what it's there for. I got the module loaded. Maybe some of you can see that. We got two listeners set up. One for the initial interpreter session, and the second for the session coming back from Fusion. So I'm setting up the interpreter session. I'm just using a binary to make my life easy. So that's the initial session. I'm just setting the session value if you can't read it. Checking the options. You see that everything is copacetic. And then I'll run it in a couple seconds. Very long couple seconds. That's a bunch of debug output. So you can see it does leave an artifact, that shell. Your payload could, of course, then kill that shell. It'd be pretty much a blank. I didn't bother with that because I didn't want to anger the demo gods. much, especially since you can tell I was afraid of the demo gods enough to make a video instead of running it live, which was the original plan. But once, one of your speakers doesn't show up, you're like, all right, we'll go the other route.
All backups.
And you can't see, but it says uname, it's Darwin. Maybe some of the guys in front can vouch for that being Darwin. So the other bug is is an actual memory corruption, and Jazel's up for that.
All right, so this is the D&D use after free, the Dungeons and Dragons use after Fireball, as Dustin came up with. It basically occurs if you have drag and drop. It requires drag and drop to be enabled, which is the default for Fusion or Workstation, and it occurs when you swap D&D versions. So you go from D&D version 2, access it, or query what it is, go to D&D version 3, query what it is, and then any D&D interaction whatsoever, even actually legitimately trying to use it, will cause a use after free. It's incredibly straightforward, and it was a bug that was submitted to our program about 2 weeks before Pwn to Own. And so it comes up and we get a crash, and as far as doing analysis on it, it was fairly straightforward. You are accessing invalid memory, and so there's a command in Windowbug, bang heap, which we use to confirm that it is a freed object. Getting the size of the freed object is basically, you can use a trick by a guy named Furman Cerna, or do some more reverse engineering to figure out what it is. It's B8. Once we've found that, we have to figure out whether or not we can actually reclaim it, and we can with tools capability guest temp directory, or really any RPCI call that will result in allocating memory in the hypervisor itself. Thankfully, ROP, or getting code execution at this point, is incredibly straightforward, as VMware VMX actually has a read-write executable section in memory that it uses just for normal reasons. Why it does is a bit of a mystery, but it has it. And so you can write right into that buffer. And then ROP is then incredibly simple. You just have one gadget that will swap RDI and RSP, or RSI and RDP and RVP, and then just let it go and execute.
One thing I think failed to mention is you also still need an information leak. Those aren't horribly hard to come by either, but I just realized we don't actually mention you need an information leak.
And that's specifically for this bug. And we've blogged extensively about this bug, so if you are curious, there's the link at the bottom, either the bit.ly or the long version at the bottom. And we completely cover the details of the bug itself. So as far as the Metasploit module for this goes, it's exploit Windows local VMware DND. Only reason for it being Windows is, I don't remember why.
Because of the post API.
Oh, right.
So in the post API version, you're only limited to, or you are limited to Windows Interpreter. Therefore, the exploit is of course limited to Windows. But other than that, there's no reason this couldn't be a multi. In effect, workstation on Fusion, or workstation on Fusion, workstation on Linux, let's say, or Windows.
And this, as it's a use after free, so it's memory corruption, it only applies from the guest to the host and results in a VM escape. And as he's saying, affects Fusion and Workstation, and then anything supported by really either will work. It was silently patched in Workstation 12.5.3, which was released about a week before Pwn to Own. We don't know if VMware already knew about it or what, but kind of interesting.
We do usually get a rash of patches right before Pwn to Own. People trying to.
They're all like defensive submissions. So if one team submits or is going to participate in Pwn to Own, but they know that another team looks for bugs in a certain way, they'll often try to find bugs that way and then submit them in the hopes of killing the other team's bugs.
Brutal.
Yeah.
It used to be like that. It used to be, I got a bug, let's do it.
Lots more gaming to it now. Not a lot to talk about with the module itself. You have to use the library that Josh is working on, MSF Post VMware. And the one difference here is that you are sending data in a different way. The way we've talked about is all just sending like one buffer or one byte or one value or doing one query. Here you have to kind of say, hey, we're going to open a session and we're going to send a bunch of data and then we're going to close it. That's all implementation details, all kind of can be ignored. But just one extra detail about this. As far as calling that in the module itself, it's pretty straightforward. You just make calls to the send RPC command over and over and over again. Really, you call it, I think, 6 times. 5 for the bug itself, the 5th being the retrigger of the use after free. And then the 6th time, which is actually the first time, is to write to the RWX section so that you have a spot to land in. Yeah. And this is one of the things that kind of got left behind because of the last-minute switch between Abdul and me pushing him off.
Hang on. Realistically, it ended up being my fault because during the switch of speakers, one thing the specific detail that got lost was our exploit was originally written for workstation on Windows 7 64-bit, which I did not bring because I didn't actually know that. I do have an 86. I have a 32-bit. I have Windows 10 64-bit. I have Windows 8 64-bit. I have everything but the one that the exploit was written for. So we stayed up a lot of hours that I would not quantify to convert it, and we failed, quite frankly.
We currently have a module that will nicely crash VMware VMX, and it'll say access violation, so there's that.
So we know we're in the right ballpark, but to get figured out.
The bug itself is still there. It's not even getting to the shellcode yet. It's just things are aligned in a little bit different manner on Workstation 10 when it's on Windows 10.
So here's the Python version of it, though it doesn't get an interactive session. It just pops calc like we're used to doing.
Yeah.
So,
but nice and straightforward, very clean, very quick.
Yeah, there's really not a lot to this particular bug. It was quite interesting, minus the fact that we still couldn't.
Right. And the only issue with it is that it does need an info leak in order to know the base of VMX or VMware VMX in order to continue on, so that you know where to land and where the RWX section is. And all of this was done like this is a Mac that's the host that you're seeing this.
I can prove it
on. Yeah. And one thing that's kind of interesting is like while we were doing all the testing at hours at night, it was VMware or a Mac OS host running VMware Fusion, Windows 10 running in VMware Fusion, and inside that there was Workstation. Inside that was Windows 10 again. So you kind of had like VM inception. And one thing that kind of came in mind is that you could escape from one to then escape again, and it just kind of, inception.
Specifically with the bugs that once they fixed the last one, specifically with the bugs we presented, you could come from that host VM, that guest VM into the Workstation host into Fusion or into the Mac. So we just kind of noticed that at the end, like, we should chain these together, and it would have been a really interesting chain.
All right, so as everyone can give a question. TCLO? Yeah. So you cannot manipulate what gets sent back to TCLO to you from RPCI because every VM gets its own VMX process. And so at least if I'm making the right assumption, you're trying to go from your VM to another. That wouldn't work because it's through another process. Otherwise, it would be a decent vector.
Unless you first exploited the process and jump process.
But the thing is, at least on Windows, these processes are all medium integrity, and medium integrity processes can inject into others. So if you do that, you could then, do things. Yeah. As well as just in general manipulating all sorts of things about the VMware state. In conclusion, virtualization is definitely it's commonplace. I really don't want to use the word of things in the sky, but that's a huge thing. It's all over. Amazon, Azure, all sorts. And VMware is incredibly widely deployed, especially ESXi, and bug reports are on the rise. There's this kind of assumption with VMs that they're safe and secure and they're a great way of isolating things, and that is completely false. It's just that people have not been looking at them. One thing that comes in mind with VMware is, as part of Pwn2Own, we do vendor dupe checks. So if a vendor already knows about the bug, that affects things. And with VMware, I remember when I handed them the second VM escape, I asked them, is this a unique bug? Do you already know about this? And while the USB stick was in the guy's hand, he says no. And I just look at him like dumbfounded, and he says, every bug we know about, we patched last week. And you gave me, this is the second bug you're giving me, and you're telling me it's different, so it's different. And that's just kind of frightening, because I know there's going to be more security bugs in VMware, that there have to be. And so yeah, we need to break this bad assumption that virtualization is going to protect you. It is a measure that can make things difficult, but it's not as great a barrier as we currently think. And so, okay, backdoor interface is definitely robust and apparently well named because, yes, it can be a backdoor into the hypervisor. Clearly not what they actually intended, but hey, it works for us. And then these bugs also affect ESXi. We're primarily talking about Fusion and Workstation, but ESXi, which is all over, is definitely just as vulnerable. And then there are the less critical bugs where you can still get data leakage, as he mentioned, like password managers. If your password ever makes it to a copy buffer and you have a VM that's owned, that could be game over, and that would really suck.
Especially if it's in the cloud. I hate to say it, sorry, I used the bad word, but
I avoid it.
It's in the cloud. You have no, if you're in you don't know which physical host you're on, right? You don't know who's on those other hosts. So they might just be copying whatever's on every copy buffer on any host, physical host. You know what I mean?
And on that note, thank you for listening. We are Joshua Smith, Colonel Smith, and Jazel Spellman, Wandering Glitch from the Zero Day Initiative. And we also have lots of heavy metal ZDI coins, so please come and get them because you'll be saving our backs. Also, does anyone have any questions? See no hands. Thank you.